what I want to talk about is the using of translation process methods in audiovisual translation and media accessibility. Translation process research is quite well established within translation studies and within interpreting studies, but within AVT and media accessibility, it's not really there yet. There are bits and pieces, but there isn't really a lot. So before we start at all, we'll just go to the very beginning. And something that is very basic that I'm sure most of us know is that translation can be regarded both as a product and as a process, right? You can have a translation as the book and translation as the process of translating the book. And the same applies with audio description. This is something that Agnieszka actually wrote years back, that audio description is both the additional track inserted into the film, but it's also the process of audio describing. Is the same way. We have live subtitles, but you have the process of re-speaking. You have subtitles, but you have the process of subtitling. And while within translation studies, both things have been investigated, both translation as a product of the final outcome of the action of translation and the process. It hasn't really been done in AVT or media accessibility yet. If we look at translation, and from now on, we will just depart from thinking about translation as a product. We will just concentrate on the process. The process of translation is usually broken down even further. You have something that is called a translation event and a translation act. Now, translation event, as you can see, it's larger, and then translation act is embedded within the event. The general idea behind that is that the translation event is the entire sociological and situational context that begins when a translator accepts the job and ends with the payment of the bill. So that's the entire thing. And the translation act is the cognitive process that starts when the translator begins to read the source text, if it's a written translation. In case of audio description, that would be the moment when the translator or the describer starts to watch the film or the picture that he's describing, for example. The same with subtitles. No, the translation act in subtitling starts when the subtitler turns on the software and watches the film. Now, this distinction is quite important because from this distinction, we have two different paths in translation process research. Before we go to those paths, I think it's very important to talk about the different types of processes that are investigated within translation studies, and also maybe the different approaches that translation scholars take when investigating the process. According to Andrew Chesterman, you can have four processes or four ways of modeling the translation process. You can have the virtual process, which is the approach which presents solutions that translators might take to solve a problem. And another one, which is quite similar, is the reversed engineered process. And that's an approach where you, based on the solutions used, you reconstruct the potential process taken by the translator. And I think those two are most common in AVT and media accessibility, both in many articles that we all have written, but also in, I think it's a typical MA or BA thesis. No, you take a text and you say, okay, the translator did that, the translator did that, and he could have done that and that. But this isn't the actual process research. It's us having a theory of what has been done and why, and very often, we don't really know why the translator translated something like this or omitted something, or and so on. So there are two other things that Chesterman talks about, and that's the actual process, and that's the approach in translation process research. And it's based on the data that you gather during the observation of the actual process of when the translator, when the interpreter, when the subtitler, or the audio describer is working through a variety of methods. You could use, that we'll discuss later on, you can use keylogging, eye tracking, think aloud, recording. And based on this, you try to model the process. And one more thing that is there is the sociological event, which is also part of translation process research right now. And this goes beyond the translation act. It goes to the translation event. And you also observe how the environment of the translators influence the way they work. And then there's a different set of approaches. Today, we'll actually concentrate more on the actual process, but it's important to remember that sorry, translation process research, TPR, has those two components. Why is it important to remember that? Because very often you will still hear that the basic question or the basic aim of translation process research is to answer the question of by what observable and presumed mental processes translators arrive at their translations. So you could have this very limited view of what translation process is, which was sometimes described as thinking that, you know, your brain is an isolated thing, that it has no interaction with the outside world, which is not true according to the new theories of cognition, which is called embodied cognition or extended cognition. So there are two components of translation process research, and Jakobsen, who's one of the main figures in translation process research, he refers to them as a microscopic view and a telescopic view. So the microscopic view would be the micro level of solving linguistic challenges in the mind of the translator, but the broadened scope includes also looking at the interaction with environmental, with ergonomic, with psychological, with personal, and with emotional things. So you could work into interaction of translators with the workplace, with technology, with other people, for example, and also how their emotions influence what they do. Okay. But this actually goes even further, it extends even further, and we'll mention that in a second, but for now, we can just assume that translation process research looks into translation and interpreting processes, the actual processes, from cognitive, psychological, and behavioral perspectives. So that's broad enough, but also small enough. Now, because it's an ever-expanding field, what is now claimed by at least some scholars is that there's a new discipline that is called cognitive translation and interpreting studies. Sorry. And that process research is a branch of this bigger field, of this umbrella field, which is the cognitive translation and interpreting studies. That is devoted to studying the cognitive aspects of communicative production, reception, and interaction of all participants. That is actually very important because that means that also reception studies are included within the cognitive translation and interpreting studies. Some people even include that into translation process research, claiming that if the translator thinks about the potential audience, that also influences them in a way. And I think this is what we have always been taught to do, no? To think about the potential audience while we translate. Now, what is super interesting with translation process research, at least for me, and this is something that drew me into this, is the methodology that it has. It's been said that translation process methodology and translation process scholars are borrowers because they borrow from many other fields, such as psychology or corpus linguistics or psycholinguistics or anthropology, neuroscience, but also writing research. And I think this is not a complete list, it's just an example. To put them, well, not all of them, but most of them on the map, I'll show you the classification that has been drawn by Krings in 2005. He basically says that TPR research has two types of methods. The first one, the first bigger umbrella is are offline methods, and the second are the online methods. The difference between the offline and online is actually quite simple. Offline methods are the methods that are applied after translation is carried out. So you ask someone to translate, and then when they are finished, you start with your methods. And then online methods are used during the translation. So they allow you to observe the process as it evolves. And now the offline methods, there are two more bags. One of them is product analysis, and the second one is verbal data elicitation. And then we'll comment on those in a moment. And then in the online methods, there are also two bags. The first one is behavioral and psychophysiological observation. And the second one are methods that rely on verbal data elicitation. And as you can, if you're looking at this, there are a lot of methods that are being used. We will not discuss all of them today because we simply don't have time. So what I did was I've chosen the ones that have been used in AVT or media accessibility to show you how they have been used and what they are doing actually. What is important, and this is something that will come up at the end, so I will try to show you one entire experiment with different methods used, is that one type of data in translation process research is very unlikely to be sufficient. It's really insufficient. It does not provide significant insight into the translation process. And just to give you an example right now, you can record somebody's key movements, and that will give you data on, for example, the length of the pauses they make when they type, or the structure of the pauses. But you will not know the motivation of the pauses unless you have maybe a think aloud protocol, or maybe a recording of the screen or of the person. So TPR is increasingly resorting to mixed methods and data triangulation. And this is also important to remember when you plan your experiment. And another thing important to remember if you want to do TPR experiments is that all those methods have their pros and cons. And for quite a long time, there have been discussions of, oh, this method is better than the other one. Use keylogging, don't use think aloud protocols. But it actually all depends on what you want to do in your experiment. If you want to look more into the decision-making process, then think aloud protocol is probably better for you than other methods, than eye tracking. But if you combine them both, then you might have more significant, better results and better data as well. Now, we'll just, through some of them, we'll just browse. I wanted to stop here and just bring your attention to the fact that partially, that product analysis is used in TPR. It's not that it's not used at all. But the thing is that if you only analyze translations, only analyze translation notes or journals, or if you compare different translators, different translations by the same translator, or different translations by different translators, this is not process research. And this is something that has already been noticed by Klings, one of the founding fathers of TPR, is that still very often in translation studies, when people talk about translation process, it very often still involves theoretical modeling and from linguistic or semiotic point of view. But the idea behind process research is to try to answer the question of why a translator in a certain moment arrives in a certain situation, arrives at a certain translation, at a certain result when working with a certain text. So yes, when you do translation process research, you can also analyze the text that your experiment participants produced, but it cannot be the only thing that you do because it's not process research. Now, the offline methods that are used, there are 4. You could have a retrospective commentary or a retrospective interview, a retrospective questionnaire, which basically means, and you can also have something that is called integrated problem and decision reporting, where translators, while they translate, after they translate, they describe what was their problem, or what were the crisis points. In all those cases, you administer those after the translators finish translation. So a nice thing about those is that you don't disturb the translators while they work. So their process is, let's call it, natural. But then if you administer things when they are finished, they don't really remember everything anymore very well. No, I think our memory is not as fantastic and as perfect as we wished. So good, but remember that there are some minuses or some drawbacks to those methods. The good thing about those methods, well, the good thing is that they don't really require that much knowledge in terms of methodology. I'm not saying they don't require any, but it's much easier to do an interview than to use eye tracking. So that's a good starting point for TPR and perfectly usable. Now the interesting methods, the sexy methods, are the ones that you use online. So while translators, interpreters, audio describers, subtitlers work. And if you look at them, there's quite a lot, and it's still expanding. You have observation, so you can observe someone while they work. You can record people while working. You can record their screen while they're working. You can use keylogging. We'll discuss that in a second. It's basically software that allows you to log all the mouse clicks and all the keyboard clicks. You can use eye tracking, which I think you have covered after this summer school. You can use, and has been used, EEG. You can have fMRI, PET, EPI, and also two things that are quite new in a sense, 20 years, but still quite new. It's heart rate variability and galvanic skin response or skin conductance. Now, what I would like to discuss today, even if very briefly, are the things that have been already used in AVT/media accessibility. And those are those methods that are now underlined. So you have video recording, screen recording, keylogging, eye tracking, EEG, and heart rate and galvanic skin response. I hope we have time to go through all of them, but I think we do. So what I will try to do now is I'll try to tell you more or less what they are and what kind of data they can bring us. Okay, so that's one. And then we'll also go very briefly through some studies in AVT or media accessibility that have used those methods. Okay, we'll start with keylogging. Keylogging is an important word here is unobtrusive online data gathering method. Unobtrusive, that means that that your participants don't know that they're using it. It's a software program that runs in the background, so nothing changes. They just work on the computer. They don't really notice that they're being recorded in any way. Keylogging registers all keyboard and mouse activity. If you delete something, if you insert something, if you cut and paste, if you change windows, it's all recorded and also with a timestamp. Now, the data that you can get from keylogging is, for example, time spent on task. Why is it important? Because you might want to compare how experienced versus trainees work. If someone works faster, for example, okay? Or is a certain type of video easier or faster to subtitle than a different one? You can also record typing speed, which can also give you some information about the fluency, about experience, about how well somebody works. You can also get information about the number and duration of pauses, and also information about searching time. So how much time did the translator or the describer spend on searching the internet? And then you can compare it between different describers. That's nice, right? You can also get reviewing time. That's also nice, but the question is, so what? I mean, you get all this data and great, but so what? The idea in translation process research is that based on this data, you can make assumption about temporal effort, production effort, and cognitive effort. So how much time people your participants needed to complete the task, and how is it different between the different groups, how much cognitive effort was involved, and how much production effort was involved. What I want to show you now is actually 3 films prepared by the creators of InputLog, one of the freely available software that is out there that we can use. It was actually developed at the University of Antwerp, so it's a bit of PR, but I've started using it before I even thought I would ever be in Antwerp. It's a very good program developed for writing research, but it's also used for translation. And the 3 videos that are here will explain you a little bit what the program does, but also what keylogging does as such. Let's just hope it works.
Are you a writing researcher? Are you interested in writing processes, and do you want to know what goes on in the writer's mind? If so, then InputLog might be a tool for you. Some writing researchers focus on text analysis and are mainly interested in the writing product. Other researchers, however, are more interested in the ways in which texts gradually emerge. Their focus is mainly on the writing process. It's like a football game. Sometimes you're interested in only the final score, but you can also watch the entire football game and enjoy the moves of all the players, that is, the process. InputLog can be used in a wide variety of writing research studies. For example, you can compare writing processes in a first language and in a second language. You can also study translation processes or explore writing development across the writer's lifespan. So how can you use InputLog? You simply start the program in the background, and from then on, every keystroke and cursor movement will be logged in combination with a timestamp. Revisions and switches from one window to another to consult other sources are also logged and timestamped as well. When the writer has finished, you store the log data and you can start analyzing them. InputLog provides an extensive set of different analyses, each focusing on different perspectives of the writing process. Some analyses also generate graphs. What's more, you can analyze the log data generated by one person, but also by a group of people. The program then merges the results and makes them available for further statistical analyses.
Okay, I certainly hope you can hear the video.
Are you a writing researcher? Are you interested in writing processes, and do you want to know what goes on in the writer's mind? If so, then InputLog might be a tool for you. Some writing researchers focus on text analysis and are mainly interested in the writing product. Other researchers, however, are more interested in the ways in which text
Sorry. There you go. That's the second
While
one.
composing text, writers can produce text either from memory or by consulting online sources. Sometimes writers are distracted by a Facebook alert, or they simply decide to take some downtime by watching, for example, a YouTube video. InputLog logs all these writing activities and keeps track of writers' interaction with and use of sources. It shows which sources have been consulted and how long writers have spent reading or watching them. The logged source data can then be used in detailed analyses and can be visualized to give an overview. There are 2 ways in which InputLog visualizes the source interaction during writing. The first one is by generating what's called a process graph. This graph represents how long writers spend writing their texts and when they decide to switch to other windows. When you hover the cursor over the graph, you'll also be shown exactly which sources have been used. The second visualization method is a network graph showing the interaction between different sources and the main document that's being composed. Finally, you can use the source analysis to investigate differences and similarities in source use between writers. The program merges the results and makes them available for further statistical analyses.
Okay, and the last one.
While fluency is an essential component of writing text either from memory or by consulting online sources.
So, I don't know, anyway, we can skip the last one. I hope it gave you a little bit of...
Are you a writing researcher?
a little bit of an overview of what a keylogging software can do. And then to ground it somewhere, there has been a study done by David Orrego, Łukasz Dudka, and Agnieszka. Agnieszka, if you want to step in at any time, you're very welcome to comment on the study. And then there were many aspects to analyze, and they used eye tracking and screen recording and keylogging. And just to show you what came from keylogging data, they did a comparison between two groups, experienced and trainees in subtitling, experienced professional subtitlers and trainees. And if you look at the keylogging data, it shows that professionals were faster than trainees. And then another thing that came out was that professionals have less mouse clicks and more key pressing than trainees. And if I remember correctly, the idea that was because professionals used more keyboard shortcuts, which also might have influenced how fast they worked. So that was one of the things in the study that keylogging was used for. And the other one was to compare the production and the temporal effort between in professional subtitlers when they used easy titles and when they used a different software that they are more used to using. And again, if you look at it with the other software, the professional were more used to, they were working faster, but they were also using more. They had more mouse clicks but less key presses. So this is kind of data you can get from keylogging, and then of course you have to interpret it. It's very often it's good to mix it with other methods to explain some things that the keylogging cannot explain. Like you saw in one of the films, it shows you what sources people consulted. But you don't really know what exactly did they consult. You don't have access to that through keylogging, if I'm not wrong. And then another thing that is there when it comes to methods in translation process research is screen recording. Again, right now with the software that we have, it's an unobtrusive data gathering method, which allows you to access what happens on the screen. You can either use it in a lab setting, but there's more and more software that you can use remotely. So you can actually have the translator work from their own home, and they just, it's a small plugin that they turn on that records their screen, and also, which we will see in a second, can record their face. What data does it give you? You can monitor mostly the online search activity. So you are not only aware of that they are searching, but you can know what they are searching for. Okay, so not only that they are searching, where they are searching, but also what they're searching for, which is important. Very often, and again, a short video from the study by David Orrego, Łukasz Dudka, and Agnieszka Jakobsen, which shows you a recording from a screen of one of the subtitlers that was in the experiment. What we are seeing is the easy title software and also the other windows that the subtitle is opening. This is combined with eye tracking as well. But basically, you can just sit and watch what did the translator and subtitler in this case do. Okay. Another method that is out there, and it's also nice to combine with other methods, is face recording. It hasn't been really used that much in translation process research. Basically, you record participants' face, and this way you can have access to the activity of the translators and their emotions. Let me show you some screenshots from my study where I worked with scribers. So what you can see is it's a recording of both their screen with their faces embedded. Now, why is that important to have, or might be important to have? When the translators make a pause, Keylogging will notice the pause, right? Screen recording will also show you that nothing is happening, but the face recording will show you what is happening. Did the translator, I don't know, did they just pick up the phone and this is why they're not working, or are they thinking? Are they doing something else? Did they leave the room? That's one thing. So you have more data on the same issue. So you might be able to pinpoint it better, to explain something better. Another thing that can happen here, and it's not happening yet, but we are also hoping to try it, is AI analysis of the face recordings for emotions. Emotions are one of the things that are becoming increasingly important in translation process research to see how emotions affect the translators and their translations. It's been done more in interpreting than in translation, but AI is one of the options. And let me just show you very shortly how it could work if you have a recording of somebody's face, which is now very easy to do because you can do this via a webcam with a remote recording software. Okay, as I said, this has not been tried yet in TPR, at least according to my knowledge. So something very new, something that you would methodologically have to experiment with how to do that. Is it even valid? Are the emotions that people experience while translating strong enough for the software to recognize it? Because maybe we just sit there, with a square face and do nothing. But it's something that is definitely worth experimenting with, I think. And then the last batch is the online methods that rely on verbal data elicitation. And there are 3 methods. They are similar. You have talk aloud protocols, think aloud protocols, and dialogue protocols. Going from the last one, dialogue protocols is when you give a translation task to 2 people and you ask them to talk about it, to comment out loud. Talk aloud protocols is when you give a translation task to someone and you ask them to verbalize, it's difficult to explain, verbalize the linguistic thoughts that they have in their mind, something that they would normally think to themselves, but you ask them to speak it out loud. And then think aloud protocols is something that is most commonly used. And this is when you ask your participants to verbalize their thoughts. Also to comment on their actions. It's very good if you want to access their cognitive processes, if you want to observe the decision-making process, for example, of how they arrive at a certain decision. Did they, the typical, the translator decided to use omission. Well, maybe he didn't decide to use omission, maybe he just didn't notice something. That's possible as well, especially in audio description. To give you a snapshot of how it looks, this is also from my study. The describer speaks in Polish. So I've embedded subtitles in PowerPoint. I hope it works.
Co my w tym filmie chcemy pokazać, wydaje mi się, jest ważne. Emocji tutaj za dużo nie widać. Myślę, że ważniejsze byłoby może napisanie coś więcej o Krakowie, skoro jest to film umiejscowiony właśnie w Krakowie. Z drugiej strony ta scena z ptakami, która obsiadła, jest taka śmieszna i to warto też byłoby przekazać. Dobrze, jeszcze raz sobie to obejrzę.
Okay, so you basically had a describer who comments on her future action. She was deciding what to include in the description, what would make sense to describe as the next thing. The issue with taps, and that's something very, very interesting and also worth investigating. It's something that is called taps reactivity. Taps were very popular at the very beginning of translation process research, which dates back to, let's say, 1980s. It dates back more, but we can go to 1980s. And then it has been dropped when keylogging and tracking arrived. that are less obtrusive. They interfere less. Because there was a concern that from the point of view of observing the process, taps might impact the process itself, especially when it comes to the temporal effort, so how long the translators take to write, and also the cognitive effort. The thing with this is that even though it has been said, it hasn't really been researched. So there's very few studies that have empirically tested TAP's validity or TAP's reactivity. And this is also something that is, I think, worth picking up in research. What I found and what I really like is one of the more recent articles that says that, okay, maybe TAPs are reactive, maybe they affect how long people take to carry out the translation, but it doesn't mean it affects how they do this. And it's a very nice quote that, you know, if you follow the same path as usual, the fact that you work slower or take smaller steps doesn't mean that you've chosen a different path. But again, this goes back to what do you want to do in your research? Because if you want to have an experiment in which you compare how fast different groups of translators are, then maybe TAPs are not your choice, okay? But if you want to see how they work, how they make their decisions, why they make certain decisions, then TAPs are probably the thing for you, okay? And then the last two things that are very new in our field is heart rate variability, and that's a psychophysiological measure. You use sensors for that, and it measures the irregularities in the time that passes between consecutive heartbeats. Now, why is that important? Because it can give us information about emotional elicitation. That's one thing. When you're stressed and or other negative emotional states may result in reduced heart rate variability, and also. There has been research outside of translation studies that shows that low heart rate variability might be indicative of enhanced attention. So this is something you could use, for example, maybe for presence. This is actually what we did, and I can tell you about the research in a second. Has this been used in translation process research? There has been none in AVT&MA so far. There has been a few cases, few studies in interpreting studies. Mostly so far, heart rate variability has been used in reception studies. There have been studies by Marina Ramos-Caro on objective versus subjective audio description and how people react. There has been research in UAB by Gonzalo Iturragui Gallardo on dubbing versus voiceover, how the audiences react. And also we used it for a study on how audiences react to different intonation in audio description, to like interpreted and non-interpreted intonation in audio description. The problem with heart rate variability, and I think this is one of the reasons it's not very popular in TPR yet, or maybe it will never be, is that it's a bit tricky and it can be changed very easily. In a sense, if your participant has a coffee in the morning, their heart rate will be different, okay? And then also it requires a very particular lab setup. When we worked with heart rate variability, we had to ask our participants not to move too much. So you can watch a film and not move too much, but how can you work and not to move much? You always work, you always budge a little bit. And another thing to consider if you ever want to work with heart rate variability is that it's very individual, it's very different between people. So if you want to use it, maybe consider within subject design rather than between subject design. You cannot compare results of two different people and their heart rate variability because their baseline is different. It's the same for galvanic skin response. This is basically a lie detector. It monitors how your hands sweat and how this sweating changes. And it also can give you information about emotional state, emotional arousal, about stress. And similarly to heart rate, it's very individual. So if you ever do this within subject is much better than between subject as design, but also the setting has to be very peculiar. If it's too hot, too warm, it is quite complicated, and the results, the data you get aren't always of great quality. It has not been used in process research, in translation, in AVT or MA. There have been some studies in interpreting, but so far it has been used in this bigger umbrella of cognitive translation and interpreting studies, again on dubbing versus voiceover, a reception study, and intonation in audio description, voicing, again, a reception study with audiences. If you're interested in those two, there are two fantastic articles that are freely available. One is in Jostrans and the other one is in Linguistic Antwerpienza. The first one discusses both methods, what they are, what are the tricks, what are the pros, what are the cons. And the second one concentrates on the skin conductance, and it also discusses what are emotions, how to measure them, and what you have to consider if you want to use the electrodermal activity as your method. Now, since we still have a little bit of time, what I wanted to show you is a full experiment that used different process research methods. It was an experiment in which I wanted to see how describers work and how they work when they are confronted with films from outside of their culture. So what happened was we had describers from Poland and from Spain working on Polish and Spanish films. And the idea behind this, to those of you who are not close to audio description, is that in audio description, very often people are told, describe what you see. But the idea is that I think we don't see the same thing. That this summer school is a bit in the cloud, but if it wasn't for COVID, it would be in Poland, and maybe you would see this for lunch, and maybe you would see this when you went for a walk in the evening. And for many of you, you know that you are seeing pierogi and that you're seeing downtown of Warsaw. But I think for people who have never been to Poland and know very little about Poland, they would just see food and a city. So, you know, if you had a describer who doesn't know Poland, because why would he know Poland, right? His description would be very different than the description of someone who knows Poland or who is from Poland. So that was the idea behind the experiment. And what the describers did was they worked at home. They were recorded remotely. Their screens were recorded, their faces were recorded. We used keylogging. And also I've asked them to do think aloud protocols. So they've commented while they were working. And just to show you, and before the experiment, they came to the lab for a very short eye tracking experiment. The results that we have show, for example, that describers work in recursive loops. There are a number of tasks that they perform when they work. They try to understand the text. That means they watch the video, and they watch the video not only once, even though the video we gave them was 1 minute long. They watched it a number of times before they started. They watched a number of times, even 5 seconds that we were supposed to describe. They had a planning stage in which, as you saw before, they commented, okay, so what's next? What I'm going to describe? What is important? What is relevant? There was a moment when they were generating text, they were writing. Then they were queuing, so they were checking if the text fits between the dialogues in the time that they had. They were also reviewing the text, they were correcting mistakes, they were making changes, and they were also doing something that is revision. In this case, they would reread the entire text to see if it flows well, and also if it fits in the time that they have. Now, those things don't happen one after another. They happen in a recursive loop in audio description. So they watch, they write, they review, they revise, they cue, they watch, they write, and they review again, even though they work in very short films. Another thing that came out from this, and this, I'm sorry, it's oversimplification. The general idea is that on the left, that's a screenshot from a Polish film. And on the left, you have the heat map, the gaze map from Polish describers, and on the right from the Spanish describers. The main idea behind this was that most of the times when there was a cultural reference, the time to the first fixation was longer, if that was a foreign reference, which could mean that if describing a foreign film, describers were less likely to recognize the foreign culture reference. There were also less fixations, and the fixations were shorter, which could mean on the foreign element, which could mean that they are less capable of finding and recognizing this element. That's a nice theory. In practice, that means that most of the describers, when they were describing foreign films, their descriptions were much more generic, and many of the foreign flavors were omitted or generalized because they were unnoticed or unrecognized. And what came from the analysis of the text that they've produced, but also from Think Aloud protocols, I think it's also interesting. You can see you have 5 different descriptions of the same thing. The thing is a very typical Polish red beetroot soup that we use for that we eat mostly for Christmas. So if you're Polish, I think, and if you're seeing this image, you say, "Oh, Christmas." Okay, you know straight away. And then if you have a look at the different descriptions prepared by Spanish describers, it goes from anywhere from a red soup, which is very generic, to beetroot soup, to borscht, typical Polish Christmas soup. So it really depended on what the describers looked for, how cautious they were, if they knew Polish culture or not, if they thought that their audiences would know this soup. But their comments from the Think Aloud protocols were also very interesting. The one that you see here is that in a nutshell, I don't know what it is, so people who are blind also won't know what it is. So I'll just describe it. I will not give a name. I will not say what it is. Sometimes the describer said, okay, I know what it is, but if I give the name, then people won't know because they have never been to Poland. So maybe I'll give a name and describe it as well. So that was also something very interesting to have a look at. And then for me, the most important in that study was that it combined different methods. And I think this is why we had a very good effect, because we could really look at the process and really understand the process. Now, with those lovely methods, there are also new challenges. Anna has mentioned some of them this morning. So very briefly, first of all, you have new methodologies. I think in many cases, they go way beyond what we know how to use and what we use. So we need to pair with people from other fields, which is, I think, a fantastic thing. There's many problems with that in terms of institutions, or where do you submit your paper, or how do you actually do the experiment, because we have different traditions. But that's something that is happening. But I think also that means that you will have to, by trial and error, establish our own methodology in AVT. Then you are working with human participants. So you have all the ethical issues. You have to get ethical approval. You have to think about how to store and preserve your data. And also, if you want to work with translators, you have to think about paying them. I mean, they are professionals, and you ask them to spend, I don't know, 5, 10, 3 hours on your thing. I think it's ethical to pay them. However, there have been discussions on is it ethical to pay participants. I have not heard that discussion outside of translation studies, but I have heard it in translation studies, because maybe if you pay your participants, they participate differently. Okay, so this is one of the things that we have to have in mind, that in translation studies, not all the things are yet established. Also, there are things about experimental design. You have to choose your method well. You have to think whether you're going for qualitative or quantitative methods and data. And then what is the length of your clip? This is a very personal experience, because we have just written 2 papers, and in both the reviewers said, yeah, but your clips were 1 minute long. I think they should have been 10. And you go, okay, but why? Why? Why should have they been 10 or not 15 or not 40 seconds like in psychology? So this is also something that in AVT, I think we have to still try and see what works, what doesn't work. Also the number of participants, what is the right number? What is the right number of stimuli per participant? And also in translation process research, another important thing is the setting. Do you want to do a lab experiment where you have all the control, but it's a bit artificial? Or do you want people to work from home, which you have less control, but maybe they feel more at ease? So it's also something to consider before you even start. And last but not least, translation process research in AVT and media accessibility. I think I have already made my point that there isn't a lot, but just to show you that there isn't a lot and maybe to inspire you. In subtitling, so far, there have been 4 studies on translation process research. The first 3 compared professional and trainees in subtitling. Massey and Jude, they looked at using translation process research as a tool for education, self-reflection in students. In dubbing, there has been 1 study on the dubbing process. There has been 1 study in respeaking, but there are 4 articles, I think, because they analyzed the different aspects measured in the study. Very interesting. They looked at the cognitive load in intralingual and interlingual respeaking, the visual attention distribution in interlingual speaking. I think you can have a look at that. In audio description, we have more studies, but the first one, Posadas Rodriguez, she actually analyzed her own process. So it was a bit like analyzing her diary. Then myself and Ana Fernandez-Tourné and Ana Matamala, we did a bit of process research, but it was using the offline method. So we asked describers to describe, and I've asked them to measure the time, and Ana Fernandez and Ana Matamala, they've asked them to assess their effort after translating audio description and post-editing audio description. There have been 2 studies that used translation process research, Ivana Mazur and Jana Holsanova. They both used TAPS, but not really for analyzing the audio description process per se. And then there was the study that I just presented to you that is very recent. The paper is not even out yet. So, and then what I wanted to finish is that I think there is room for translation process research in AVT and MA, definitely. We can look at what are the, it's like tierra incognita, so we can do everything because nothing is done. We can see what are the AVT and MA processes. Are they really different than translation and interpreting? How contextual features influence AVT and MA processes, technology, other people, automatic subtitling and post-editing, is it different than subtitling in time? Really, it's one of the very practical discussions. No, will machine translation in subtitling actually help make it better and faster, for example? And then a popular avenue within translation process research is applying translation process research to training and the results of translation process to training. And why? Why? Because there's nothing. So if you're looking for a well-defined research gap for your project, here it is. And then I think the most important thing here is that translation process research has a well-established methodology, and AVT and MA is still limited when it comes to empirical and experimental research methodology. We still have to learn and experiment a lot, I think, to find our own experimental and methodological paradigm. And that's it. That's it. There's just a lot of references if anyone wants to read a bit about it.